Thanks, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Charlotte Blank. I represent the Maritz Institute, which is part of the Maritz family of businesses. I'm going to talk to you today about unleashing human potential by anchoring in values. And to kick things off, let's have a little fun with a video. This is a clip from one of my favorite movies called Best in Show by Christopher Guest. Maybe some of you have seen it.
We met at Starbucks. Not at the same Starbucks, but we saw each other at different Starbucks across the street from each other. And Hamilton got up the courage to walk across the street one day and approached me.
Yeah. I'd seen you at law school before.
Yeah.
And I know that sometimes I'd be in one Starbucks and then you'd be in the other Starbucks. And then I think maybe, I should go over to that Starbucks the next weekend and then you'd be at the other Starbucks. So we kind of crossed. I know, it seems so stupid
He's
now.
so good.
Ugh. I remember what I was drinking when I met you. It was a grande espresso.
That's right, and I thought that was really sexy.
Yeah,
I was drinking cappuccinos.
I remember.
And then I went to lattes, and then now double espresso, macchiato.
Right. And I'm now a big old, chai tea latte, soy milk kind of guy.
Oh, soy, yeah.
Because of the lactose.
And
And
I'm
I-
lactose intolerant now.
And I walked across the street, and there you were, and oh my gosh.
Working on my Mac.
And I had my
You had a
Mac. Oh, and then I look over, and she's reading J. Crew. It was so weird, because I was such a huge J. Crew person then, too. Still am.
But I love that clip. Aren't those delightful people, right? The yuppies from Best in Show. The most important line there, I love at the end when Hamilton Swan, that character's name is, he says, "I was such a J. Crew guy. I'm such a J. Crew guy." And that really is kind of the point of what I want to talk to you about today, which is anchoring in values. So it's this idea that in general, especially when it comes to customer experience and brands we relate to, we tend to make decisions based on who we are and what resonates with our identity versus making a consequential, rational decision or calculated purchase with each step we take. So there's some really interesting thinking coming out of the academic community that's evolved this model from a rational consequences-based approach to decision-making to the self-identity-based decision-making. So that's when you hear about people saying, "I'm a J. Crew guy," or this couple who so emotionally connected with these brands, Starbucks and Mac, that they fell in love over it. They recognized each other through these brands and this self-identity. And it's the piece, I think, is funny because it's poking fun at what these brands represent. Starbucks is about nourishing the world one cup at a time, where these people are really high-strung in this case, or working on my Mac, Apple is all about challenging the status quo and being really original and individual, and these guys are kind of the ultimate cliche yuppie type, but the joke works because it points to how powerful those brands are and the identities that they've built that massive groups of people identify with. And you can see this on the neurological level. So there's some fascinating research that shows that when people are thinking about brands that they identify with, right, if I'm a J. Crew guy, when he's looking through that J. Crew catalog or even exposed to a J. Crew logo, while his brain activity is being measured, you see similar brain activity when people are contemplating themselves, i.e. rating themselves on a certain scale, as you see when they're contemplating a brand or another person that they identify with. So there's a lot of evidence here that we make our decisions based on an identity or at an emotional level. So I think that companies do well to think that through and do what we can to connect on an emotional level. And so to make that point, we have a concept called the 90% rule. I love this image of an iceberg because it really shows you what 90% looks like. So some estimates say that even up to 95% of our brain activity, the decisions we make, the choices we make, the experiences we perceive happen at the emotional level. So there's kind of two separate processes in our brains activated in two different regions. There's the rational brain, which makes calculated decisions that take a lot of energy, a lot of cognitive energy to do rational, calculated thinking. And we're able to do that as humans because the vast majority of information we're processing is done below that level of consciousness. So most of the inputs that we receive from our surroundings actually are processed by our emotional brains first before they even get to that rational layer. And this all happens automatically and below that level of consciousness. So it's amazing to think if you're sitting on top of that iceberg, right, in a rational state of mind, it's very difficult to access or explain, let alone predict, what's going to be happening at that emotional level. So it's in many ways difficult to rely on survey data or asking people how they feel about a certain purchase or expecting them to make a rational, calculated decision each time when the vast majority of our decision making happens automatically, instinctively, and emotionally. And this is a big opportunity for brands. This was kind of the basis of Simon Sinek's TED Talk on Start With Why. This was a really revolutionary talk about this beautifully elegant, simple concept of starting with why. So on the left, he has what he calls the golden circle, where brands do well to start with why, their purpose, their reason for existing. In Apple's case, it's individuality and challenging the status quo. Starbucks, nourishing the world, right? And then you start with your why. Why do you exist? And then go from there into the how. So if Apple exists to challenge the status quo, then how do they do what they do? We do everything with a spirit of rebelliousness. We do everything with the spirit of challenging the status quo. And only from there, only last in that sequence, do you talk about what you do. So in that example, Apple doesn't really go about saying, we're a computer company and this is why we exist. They say, we're here, why? To challenge the status quo. This is how we do what we do. Oh, and by the way, it's computers. But because of that order, it doesn't have to be computers, right? Then they had the iPod, the iPhone, and the rest is history. So this talk around starting with why I think is really interesting too on a neurological level, where Simon Sinek has drawn this parallel to that 90% rule, where when we start with why, that's an equivalent to that 90%, what's submerged below that level of consciousness. Starting with why is like speaking directly to people's emotional, automatic, non-conscious brain. And that's part of the power of it, is that automatic, fast, and emotional connection. And from a business standpoint, this is an incredibly valuable approach, because when we start with why, we cultivate loyalty. When people develop an emotional connection with the brand, when they say, I'm a J.Crew guy, or I was working on my Mac and I'm so proud of that, that emotional connection creates loyalty that reduces that layer of price comparison, where people aren't consciously comparing prices and calculating and making a rational comparison each time they shop, but they just instinctively, automatically rely on that automatic emotional connection. Whereas starting with the what, when you're just there and you say, well, we make cars. Well, so do a lot of other people make cars. If you're just starting with the what, then you start to rely heavily on promotions, or what Sinek calls manipulations. So when you're manipulating for transactions and putting out constant promotions for that price discussion, it's sort of an uphill battle. So that's part of the business rationale for starting with an emotional layer, always rooting in purpose, or starting with an anchor in values. So what does this look like in our brains? When we study that emotional connection and loyalty to a brand, what does that look like in our brains? I wish it looked like that. It looks a little more like this. So this is a great study that really launched this field of research called neuromarketing. Many of you might be familiar with the Coke-Pepsi challenge, happened in the late 70s. Anyone remember the Pepsi challenge? It was a phenomenally successful ad campaign where Pepsi, the challenger brand to Coke's massive, powerful presence, Pepsi did an ad campaign that had consumers in blind taste tests, wearing a blindfold and tasting, comparing both of the soda brands. And a lot of people actually preferred the taste of Pepsi. And that was such a successful ad campaign, pointing out the product difference and showing that, rationally speaking, people prefer the taste of Pepsi. It was so successful for Pepsi, actually, that Coke then overreacted, created new Coke, which bombed. It was a whole fiasco. It was, thankfully in Coca-Cola's past, and they've recovered. But it was a really powerful moment. So Sam McClure and his colleagues in 2004 replicated this idea of the Coke-Pepsi challenge, but they added a neurological component and did this in an fMRI machine, which measures localized brain activity in specific regions of the brain by measuring blood flow while people are doing particular tasks, in this case, sipping soda through a straw, while they're either exposed to the brand of what they're drinking or not. And in this study, they found that sure enough, in the blind condition, when subjects didn't know what they were drinking, they did indeed show greater activation in the reward center of the brain when they're drinking Pepsi. And that's basically because Pepsi has more sugar in it. And we're animals and we like sugar, and it's really kind of that simple at the product level. But what's interesting was when subjects are aware of the brand and they know they're drinking Coke or Pepsi, the situation's reversed. And we saw more activation in the reward center for Coca-Cola, which suggests that there's more to the enjoyment of drinking soda than taste. There's an actual, real-life, neurological benefit to the power of the brand. So in addition to that reward center, they also saw activity in the hippocampus, which is related to accessing memory. So Coca-Cola has over 100 years of really consistent, repetitive messaging around the emotional platform of happiness. Almost everything Coca-Cola does to a T, culturally, globally, around the world in over 150 countries, this concept of happiness. You might remember the "I would like to buy a world of Coke" joyful song that's all about happiness. How many people knew that technically Coca-Cola invented Santa Claus as we know him? That image of Santa is Coca-Cola's creation, and in fact that color of red Santa's coat is Coca-Cola's Pantone shade of red. They own that. They own our childhood memories of happiness are essentially manufactured by the Coca-Cola brand. So that's how ingrained in our cultural ethos Coca-Cola's brand is, and this concept of their immediate, subconscious, automatic connection to our sensation of happiness and how powerful that is, and probably why Coca-Cola is valued at about $200 billion for their brand, and Pepsi is around 11. So really, really powerful case study, I think, therefore, connecting on an emotional level. Another, and this one is really my favorite, the Dove Real Beauty campaign. So Dove has been around for quite some time, and for many, many years. I'm not sure if this resonates so much with this crowd, but for the ladies in the room, do you remember Dove used to focus their messaging on their product? They were always talking about moisturization and the level of lotion in their soap. And for many years, their commercials basically showed lotion filling up the bar of soap, and it was a product story. It was about our soap has the most lotion. There was a sort of, in a stroke of genius, they identified a psychological insight that globally around the world, less than 4% of women feel beautiful. At any given time, there's this global epidemic of self-esteem where almost no women feel beautiful. And their marketing team made this phenomenal shift from a product message to an emotional message. They started with why. Instead of starting with the what of the lotion-filled soaps, they started with the why, and it was about self-esteem, that we're here to create a movement of self-esteem for women worldwide, and they launched the Dove Real Beauty campaign, which was really massively popular in the media, and it showed real women of all shapes, sizes, colors, flaws and all, being beautiful in their natural state, and Dove facilitating that. And through that transition, Dove grew from a $200 million brand in the early 90s to over $5 billion today. The most watched ad of all time, in over 70 million views of this really cool YouTube video of a police artist sketch. He's one of the world experts of police artists who can draw from memory when someone describes a perpetrator of a crime. And in this case, they use this man with his back to a woman, so he can't see what she looks like, and she describes herself to him. And you notice that the language that women tend to use to describe themselves is negative. She says, oh, you know, my hips are wide, my hair is stringy, the way she describes herself. And he draws a picture of her. And then they have another woman come in and describe that same woman to him. And she uses much more positive language, and he draws the picture based on that second woman's description. And you see the difference in how much more beautiful and real that comes across when people use a more forgiving kind of description. So that video had over 70 million views. And then really importantly, Dove also launched the Self-Esteem Project, which has impacted over 17 million girls worldwide through fundraising and educational content around self-esteem. So they're really putting their money where their mouth is and embracing this double bottom line where they're having real change in the world as well. So all the more reason to make this big impact around self-esteem and that emotional connection around why they exist. This is pretty interesting. Like, brands who do this really well can actually have a reverse effect where the brand can empower the consumer based on recognition of the brand. So what I mean by this is a psychological concept called priming. There's a great study of priming where basically this means that if you have people subliminally primed with certain words that they set up a frame of mind that make people more likely to make decisions in a certain direction. So one example was a study that had a group of students filling in word games, simple little word task challenges. But what the subjects didn't know was that half of the group was being primed with words that had to do with old age, like words like Florida and walker and shuffleboard, and words that just kind of subconsciously had to do with age, but they were mixed in with the sample set, so the subjects were unaware of this consciously. But what they didn't know was what was being studied was when the participants left the room, those who had been primed with old age language walked away from the room significantly slower than those who were not primed with the old age language. So it showed how powerful priming can be at a subconscious level and affect us in ways that we're not even aware of. And brands can do this too. So there was a priming study that looked at the logos of iconic brands like Apple and Disney and found that subjects who were primed with the Apple logo, just a quick flash of Apple's apple versus just a light blob, performed significantly better at tasks of creativity, which is part of Apple's brand value. So people actually became more creative simply by being primed with the Apple brand. And same story for Disney in trust. When people were primed with the Disney logo, they were more likely to trust someone in a trust game that was played out. So there's a lot of power to brands who get this right and do this consistently over time. I'd love to see this replicated with Dove and see if we can flash people with the Dove logo and improve self-esteem. Who knows? So what does this mean for you? What does this mean for all brands? We all have some soul searching to do, right? And to think about, what do we value? And even more importantly, what do our core customers value? Because all of this only works if they're shared. So Dove and self-esteem worked because so many women around the world had this issue of self-esteem. Everyone wants to be happy, so Coca-Cola fulfills that for them. So what do our core customers value and what do we value? These are the core questions to ask and something to think through. And this is where the Maritz Institute comes in. So this is where I would kind of explain a little bit about the group I'm representing. So the Maritz Institute is, what we value is unleashing human potential as we set up, and we feel that we do this through behavioral science and design. So we're a research collaborative that connects academics, researchers, PhDs in these fields of neuroscience, social psychology, behavioral economics. We connect them to pioneering organizations so that we can test concept and theory and lab work in real-world organizations. So we help facilitate those field studies to put theory into practice and see what really works in a business sense. And we also put those insights to work and bring them to market through the concept of design thinking, experiential design, which I think many of you are familiar with from this program. So through design, we apply these insights and train our solution designers to bring these to market. So we're always thinking about stuff like this. How does behavioral science apply to what we're doing, and how do you get to know your customers better and apply what we know about the science to come at a place from shared understanding? And here are just a couple of key principles that might help in that quest to identify shared purpose and values of our customers. First and foremost, see people as people. Think of them holistically, not as a transaction. You know, there's a lot of really rich, interesting, emotional activity going on beyond a do this, get that kind of mentality. Empathy is number one. It's the crucial number one step to design and also in practicing good customer experience. And then also very important is invest in building trust, because even at this layer of shared values, once you've kind of drawn them in through an emotional connection and shared value, there's no deal without some basic level of trust and fairness. So let's go into these just a bit. So see people as people, not as transactions. This is a model that's known as the 4-Drive model. It's co-created by some professors at Harvard Business School, one of whom was an advisor of the Institute for a few years. And it's called the 4-Drive model, and it's designed to make us remember that we're driven by multiple motivators. We're not just, rats and pellets going out there to acquire stuff. We have many more motivators than that. Even rats are more complex than that, by the way. So we have these 4 independent, equally strong, but equally independent drives, as the theory goes. So the drive to acquire is familiar, it's intuitive to us, I think, especially in the business world. So that, of course, we're driven to acquire stuff, and more important than stuff is status. And more important than status is relative status. So in this mindset and this drive of acquiring things, it's all about what have I acquired compared to my neighbor, compared to my sample set. So there's an important mood regulator called serotonin hormone that tends to surge when there's an upshift in ranking status. And this is true for chimpanzee societies as well as for fraternity brothers in a frat organization. So everything we do is kind of relative when it comes to this concept of acquiring. And if you think about it, it's true in life. The more you acquire, the more you're kind of on to the next thing to acquire, which is why it's inherently somewhat unfulfilling as a drive in isolation. So that's part of why it's important to think about the other drives. So we have an equally important and strong drive to bond. There are countless studies about human beings being a social species. We've evolved to be social, and it's so crucial to our survival that there's actually isolated pieces of our brain that exist solely to recognize human faces. We're in eye tracking studies in advertising and web design, for example, where we measure where people's eyes go on the page. We're irreversibly drawn to human faces. That's where our eyes go immediately when we enter a room. It's who are the people? How do I know them? How does that kind of connect in the brain? And then interestingly, many of our emotion words are linked to this drive to bond. So when we talk about emotions, what's happening in that 90%, words like and love and shame and guilt and almost all of our emotion words have to do with relationships with others. So really that drive to bond and be social. Third drive, D3, or the drive to create. This is basically that we are drawn to novelty. We love learning. We're a learning species. We're always striving to be better, to go forward. We come to events like this, not just to be together, but to learn and to grow. The drive to create really underlies our intrinsic motivation. Sometimes you just feel like you're in the flow and you're rewarded by the work itself, even when it's not about the paycheck, but you're into something and you're learning and you're feeling good. That's a really core driver for us. And it also underlies the cultures that we create. So you find art, science, exploration in all cultures, regardless of language. Literally every single culture has some form of artistic expression and scientific exploration from that drive to create. And then also we all have the drive to defend. And this is important too. All of these connections we make, creations we build, things and status we acquire, we want to hold on to those things and keep them. And we actually have a bias towards keeping what we have. There's something known as the endowment effect or loss aversion, which means that we tend to overvalue things that we have and might lose versus the same exact item, but if we're thinking about it as something we might get in the future. We overvalue something we have and could lose. So that's called the endowment effect and is really an interesting principle we think about a lot in our program designs. And also the drive to defend, think about the thrill of playing for a sports team or cheering for a sports team, that you've got the bond there of being part of a group, but also that, pride in defending your tribe, so to speak. So this is all to say that we're driven by multiple motivators and that there's a lot of rich complexities to each individual human and to our species as a whole. And it's important to remember that as we think about our brands. I also mentioned empathy. So empathy is really key, a core component to what we do in design thinking. This image I chose here of a path going through a forest is meant to represent customer journey mapping, or taking the perspective of another person and walking a mile in their shoes, as the verse goes. So you're getting to know that end person you're designing for, or that customer you're going to be serving, and you're not thinking about them only in the context of their transaction with you, but you're thinking about their whole day, their whole life, their journey. What brings them to you? Why are they in market at all? And what's going to happen to them after they leave the transaction with you? The more you can take the perspective of that person, the better you can design an inherently delightful experience and product for them. So that's sort of the central tenet of why empathy is so important to what we teach our solution designers and what we do. And not just as a design technique, but in actually practicing customer experience, any point that we can show someone empathy is going to improve that experience, because neuroscience also tells us that just the experience of receiving empathy activates those same reward centers that you see activity in when you give someone a squirt of Coca-Cola or even a $10 bill. That lighting up of reward, of pleasure, is also activated when someone hears the words, "I understand. I see where you're coming from. I get it." just that feeling of being understood and receiving empathy is inherently motivating and rewarding. So that's a great opportunity for us that doesn't always cost anything. But when you think through that customer journey and what are the touch points that you could have with your customers, what are those opportunities to demonstrate empathy to them, because it's just so valuable. And the good news is, thanks to neuroplasticity, empathy is a practice that can be cultivated, trained, practiced, and improved over time. It's like a muscle that can be built. Empathy is not something you're born with or you aren't. It's something you can work on. So this image is of a Buddhist monk who is outfitted in some EEG sensors, which measure brain activity through electricity flow. And this is a study done by Richie Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, who studies mindfulness training, yoga type stuff, meditation, training people in compassion and empathy. And he measures what's the impact of that on the brain, and has showed that over time, especially these Buddhist monks who are really the penultimate experts, over their 10,000 hours of practicing empathy, they've actually changed the structure of their brains. Increased cortical thickness in areas of the brain that are activated when you experience yourself in another person. So that quote of empathy creates a bridge between the self and the inner experiences of another person means that I can imagine what life is like for you. I can, when I'm practicing that moment of empathy and imagining what it's like to be you, there's a lot going on in the brain, and the more I practice that, I actually improve that and change my brain structure. So something that we keep in mind and train our solution designers at Maritz. And then trust. Trust is so, so important. I think this is intuitive to us, but all of this great work around practicing empathy and building emotional connection is a bit moot if you're not starting with a basic foundation of fairness, right? Fairness and trust. So, and there's a lot of really interesting research on this. One of my favorite studies, there's a sort of this generation's Jane Goodall. He's the preeminent expert in chimpanzee ape studies, a guy called Franz de Waal at Emory, and he studies the origins of morality and where does it come from us, for us to practice goodness and be kind to one another, treat each other with altruism and understanding. His general philosophy is that these aren't traits that we invent as a human species. These are ingrained in us and evolved over time, even from our cousins, sort of farther back on the phylogenetic chain. So in this example I'm going to show you in a moment, these are capuchin monkeys, so not even like chimpanzees or gorillas, but these guys are pretty far out. You'll see they're tiny. But even they have a really ingrained understanding of fairness, which is called reciprocity in the scientific community, but you'll see in this video that they get what fairness is all about.
The other one sees that, so you give the rock to us now. Okay, so again, cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. She gets cucumber again.
That never gets old for me. I love those guys. But what's interesting about that is monkeys like cucumbers. So those cucumbers were just fine for her for the months it took to train them in this exercise. So the problem isn't the cucumbers. The problem is that her neighbor suddenly, for doing the same task, gets a grape, which has a lot more sugar in it. So again, like the Coke, Pepsi. So it's just that sense of unfairness. Why am I doing the same job as my neighbor? Or in a customer case, why does this transaction feel unfair? Are other people getting a better deal? So reciprocity is something that we've evolved to really value and understand implicitly, emotionally, over millions of years of evolution. And this has been replicated countless times through the ultimatum game, which is a really popular test in psychology that's used to measure reciprocity and fairness. And the central tenet of it is that people in this experiment are given, say it's $10, they're given a sum of money or of valuable points, and have the opportunity to either to share any amount of that with their partner. So if I'm doing that with one other person and I get the money, I can give as much as I want to that other person and keep the rest. And it's basically, that's the simple task. And so rational economics would say, if we were all just purely rational people and acting in our best interests, I would give that other person 1 penny and keep $9.99. There's no strings attached. But what the science says is that most people don't do that. Most people tend to split the $10. That's just our natural inclination. We have a sense of fairness and what's right. And hey, this guy's participating in the study too, so we tend to split and give it 50-50, even though that doesn't really make rational sense in terms of maximizing our gain. And then similar to the capuchins is in the rare cases where you do see someone give an unfair deal, and if I choose to share only $1 with that person, oftentimes that person will walk away and say no thanks. And they'll leave $1 on the table because of that sense of unfairness. So again, doesn't really make rational sense. $1 is better than nothing, but that sense of unfairness is more important really than the dollar. So it's kind of the cucumber metaphor that's like, yeah, no thanks. If someone else is getting a grape, then I'm not playing. So this is really about the relationship. You know, it's not so much about that transaction, the dollar or the cucumber, it's about the relationship and a sense of fairness that you're building with your customers. And we have some interesting research in a relationship with an academic called Paul Zak, who studies trust, and specifically studies trust in organizations and how that comes to life in our companies. And he's isolated a particular hormone called oxytocin. That's just this really fascinating, magical hormone that's really evolved to facilitate trust. So Marianne will tell you a little bit more about how we've brought that to life at Maritz in our organization. But it's also kind of to make the point that trust and bonding with one another is at the biological level something that's core to our being. It's a hormone that we're born with. And we see this come to life in organizations in their relationships with their customers, because when you're building trust with your customers based on a sense of authenticity, meaning that you're starting from a place of why, and everything, the way you do things, the how is all born from that place of why, and it all lines up. And being authentic means that you're really true to your word and that core value you share with your customers. That's a foundational building block of trust and facilitates that positive loop around shared values. So there's one of my favorite brands is Southwest Airlines. They're constantly cited as being a great place to work, a great company to do business with. That's no coincidence that they kind of facilitate this throughout, and their shared value, what they anchor in, their anchoring in purpose is love. They talk a lot about love, and you see examples of love in everything they do. They have beautiful videos online. There's one of a little boy who leaves his teddy bear at the airport. A lot of parents know this situation. I myself left a teddy bear at a McDonald's once when I was a kid. It's traumatic. And so this kid was freaking out, and they left him in another state. And so the parent called up to arrange for the teddy bear. And Southwest Airlines didn't just send the bear back, but they included a handwritten note in this sort of childlike scribbly scrawl from the bear, written to the little boy, saying, "Hey, Timmy, I had such a fun adventure in the Charlotte airport, and it was so much fun, and I got to drink Coca-Cola, and it was a great time, and I'm happy to be home, and please give me a big hug, and I love you," from the teddy bear. And it was this real tearjerker of a video, and it was all about love, and the love that you felt from the bear to the boy and the family and the brand. So a great example of Southwest being really authentic, building trust with consumers and living into their values. And I think no coincidence that people are so cultishly loyal to Southwest that after 9/11, when all airlines were really suffering, some customers even wrote personal checks to Southwest just to thank them and say, "You've been there for me, and I want to support you in these tough times as an organization," which is the only example like that I've ever heard. So, so this is all about living into your values. Thanks. Me.